All right, we ended last class finishing up pretty quickly with the Revolutionary War. In 1781, the Battle of Yorktown happens, and then I'm going to go back real quick, couple of slides. And a couple of years later, because it takes time for people to get places and information to travel, about a year and a half or so after Yorktown, you get the Treaty of Paris, in which Britain formally recognizes the United States as an independent nation. And then you've got sort of the beginnings of what is the United States. As part of this deal, a couple of things happen. First, all of this land that Britain had won from France in the French and Indian or 7 Years' War, like in 1856 or 1850, the 1850s, all becomes now part of what is now this new country, the United States. So basically, everything east of the Mississippi River here now becomes part of the U.S. Additionally, France got several colonies in the Caribbean and Africa that it had lost in the French and Indian War, and so it got some of those back. And Spain also got Florida from the United Kingdom. They had won that as part of the treaty that ended the 7 Years' War. That then goes to Spain for a short period of time. It'll eventually become part of the United States shortly, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So what is now the United States is basically all of this land from the Mississippi River all the way to the East Coast. And with this new nation, the question now is how are we going to run this new country? And so today we're going to talk about the Articles of Confederation and the beginnings of the response to it. We'll probably get about halfway through the creation of the Constitution of the United States. So the Articles of Confederation, um, even before the Revolutionary War ends, the folks in charge of what would eventually become America, the folks we call, I guess, the founding fathers, those leaders realized they needed some sort of functioning central government. Basically, during much of the Revolutionary War, the Second Continental Congress kind of served as an ad hoc or temporary government, but the only real powers they had were the ability to pay a military and to engage in international relations. Basically, like the couple things you need to do in order to do a war, right? But they realized towards the tail end of the Revolutionary War, at least partway through the Revolutionary War, we need some sort of actual government. And so they get together in 1777, shortly after like Saratoga, shortly after the French join in, and kind of when the tide turns, they're like, oh my gosh, we might actually win this thing. We need to have a real live government to sort of hit the ground running with. They come together, that Continental Congress comes together and creates what is called the Articles of Confederation. What this is a really loose, and I mean very loose, union joining of the states under the power of some sort of central Congress. Congress is a coming together. So it's like they're all coming together with at least some sense of unity. However, this government is very, very weak. Mostly, this is a direct response to their time under British rule. Under British rule, that had a strong central government that had a great deal of authority centered in the hands of a singular person, in this case, King George. And um, the colonists wanted the exact opposite of that. So they wanted a very weak government with literally no central figurehead. And so they basically only created a legislative branch. What they ended up creating was what's called a unicameral or a one chamber legislature. Right now, the United States has a bicameral legislature, the House and the Senate, sort of two halves of Congress. In this instance, in the Articles of Confederation, they created one chamber, so only one legislative body. And it had very limited authority. It could declare war, it could raise armies, and it could sign treaties. Again, the things you need to do in order to fight and hopefully end a war. But notably, it missed two key things. It did not have the ability to impose taxes. So this federal government could not raise any taxes. It all had to be on the new states, or in this case, colonies. And it couldn't regulate trade. It couldn't put up trade barriers or tariffs or anything like that. And so it had no control over each of the individual states in terms of trade. Both of these things are going to come back to haunt them in a little bit later. So the Articles of Confederation is only really around for about 10 years, right? It makes it through the end of the Revolutionary War, but within a couple of years, you're going to realize, like, wow, this government is way too limited. really doesn't do a lot of the things we need, and we're going to have some changes. Those changes end up becoming the Constitution about 10 years later. But in the interim, during that 10 years, I'll call it sort of America 1.0, or maybe the beta version of the United States, right? Um, the Articles of Confederation it has a lot of failures, but it does have a couple of key successes. And the one big key success is what it does with this new western chunk of land. Again, at the end of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the United States, this new country, gets all of this new land east of the Mississippi, basically from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. And the question is, how do they deal with it? What do they do with that new land? This is basically the one major success the Articles of Confederation has. And it does a couple of things. First and foremost, there's two laws that get passed. One is the Land Ordinance of 1785. And so, right after the Revolutionary War ends, they've got all this new land, and they have to figure out, all right, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to map it out? How are we going to, divvy it out to people? We have to have a system. It's not just a free for all. Whoever gets there gets to claim it, right? And so they established a system in which this new land could be surveyed, in which essentially that you could map it out and decide plots of, this bit of land versus that bit of land versus that bit of land in order to be able to sell it off. The whole purpose of this is this government, this Articles of Confederation, didn't have the ability to raise taxes. They had to try and raise money somehow. And so what they were going to do is they decided to sell off all of this land. It had been owned by the government. They were going to sell it to people moving west to try and build farms and stuff, but they had to figure out how to divide it up so they could sell it. And what they did is they established this system, starting in Ohio, with a way to divide up the land. And they divvied it up in this land ordinance of 1785 into what are called townships, basically these 6 mile by 6 mile plots. You can see here on the bottom right hand corner, this is actually the county that I grew up in, Kansas, has a series of 6 mile by 6 mile plots. Each of these is a township. Each township is made up of 36 sections, which are 1 mile by 1 mile. Each of the sections are then quartered, into half quarter mile by quarter mile sections. Each one of those sections is 160 acres. So basically, they just made a big, a big giant grid plan all across the western portion of the U.S., which at this point is like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, uh, uh, and Wisconsin, right? And divided up by these sections, which could very easy, and these like quarter sections, which could be easily sold off. To think about this, each quarter section, sort of a quarter mile by a quarter mile, is about 160 acres. An acre is about the size of a football field. Just to give a sense, you kind of got an image here. As part of these new plans, oftentimes in each township, one quarter section, one like quarter mile by quarter mile square, was set aside for the building of a school, which is why you see in the central part of the country a lot of these small one-room schoolhouses that are out there were set aside as part of this sort of ordinance. But this is also a big chunk of why you'll see that starting with Ohio and moving west, most of the country is laid out in these north by south grid roads. You'll see these roads all over the place throughout the Midwest, here even in California, and it is entirely going back to this law in 1785. Because these roads go along the boundaries between these sections and these quarter sections. And that is why we have to this day, a north, south, east, west grid system for most of our streets in the country. Anytime you get east of like Ohio into Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, the roads follow the terrain. They are not a grid system at all. They simply sort of follow wherever the hills and the valleys and the rivers go. As soon as you get to Ohio and west, you'll see these very easily definable north by north, south, east, west grids on these mile by mile quarter sections or mile by mile sections and 6 mile by 6 mile townships. And so they do a very good job of aligning these areas out so that they can then sell them to folks. The other thing they do is a couple years later, so they've gone and measured it. They've like mapped it out with this land ordinance. Then they create the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance, it's the northwestern portion of what was then the U.S. Again, the U.S. ended at the Mississippi River. What it did is it basically allowed for all of this new land to come into the country in the form of new states. This is what Thomas Jefferson called an empire of liberty. The reason why this is a big deal is if you compare it to like what the English did with the English Empire, with the British Empire, all of those new areas, the colonies, South Africa, India, Hong Kong, Bermuda, like all the areas that the British took over, they never let them in as equals to the rest of England or to the rest of Scotland. They viewed them as colonies. They were less than. They expanded into other areas, but they didn't give them rights. And they were governed by people a long way away and were not ever on equal footing. Imagine if in England, in London, if North Carolina and Massachusetts and Virginia and New York had each had representatives in Parliament, just like folks from Manchester or Birmingham or Leeds or Newcastle. There probably wouldn't have been a Revolutionary War because the colonists wouldn't have been colonists. They would have been Englishmen. They would have been on the exact same level as anyone else from England or Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland. But that's not the way the British did it. Is they viewed them as less than, didn't give them as much access to power. The US, the young United States, in this Articles of Confederation, in this Northwest Ordinance, decided to go the opposite direction. That if we, as we incorporate new areas, we're not just going to make them extensions of existing places. So that way, it used to be actually that like the states literally just were, the state lines were just drawn all the way to the west. And like what is now most of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois was just the western part of Pennsylvania. If you lived in what would now be, Chicago, could you imagine being governed by somebody in Philadelphia? That would seem really weird. Instead, they made it so that these areas could be divided up and come in on equal footing with the existing new states. So it wouldn't just be 13 states that just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, but the power was still on the East Coast. All these areas, as they would come into the country, would come in on equal footing and have the same rights and ability to access government as the original 13 states. And so what this did is this set a procedure for creating states out of these Western lands and made it so that the first five states from these Western lands could eventually turn into territories and then eventually into states. And that's Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The other big thing that it did is in those new Western territories, the part sort of in the olive green here on the map, it outlawed slavery in those new Northwestern territories. And this sort of begins to set up the North-South slavery divide as it extends further west, as the United States gets more land and incorporates more of that land into the country as new states. It is how those new states will come into the Union as either states that permit slavery or disallow slavery. That's going to be a major issue that eventually is going to lead to the Civil War. That kind of starts with the Northwest Territory. Um, so problems with the Articles of Confederation had all kinds of problems. One, had no ability to tax, right? They didn't have much money. It means they still had to borrow a bunch more money and they couldn't pay their army. They had took out a lot, people took out a lot of debts. And the central government literally had no viable way really to raise taxes in order to pay for those debts. Second, they could make treaties, but they couldn't really enforce them. The states held all the power. So the federal government couldn't really tell the states what to do. So the federal government could sign a treaty with another country, but the other country like would be upset because, North Carolina would just go do whatever it wanted to and ignore the treaty because this new federal central government didn't really have any much authority over the states. Again, the states held all the power. Third is in that unicameral legislature, that one legislative body, the voting system was really bad. Each state had one vote and one vote only, regardless of population. So small states at the time, Georgia was the smallest in terms of population because it just didn't have a lot of people in it yet, as compared to like Virginia, which was 20 times bigger. Virginia and Georgia each had the same amount of votes. It didn't matter how many people were in it. And so what that meant is the larger states were very upset about this because the smaller states had more power. Also, they had no ability to regulate commerce between the states. States literally, we've talked in class a little bit about the rise of tariffs, of those taxes on trade between other countries. Uh, at times, the states started putting up taxes with trade from other states. So North Carolina would throw an extra tax on any goods from Virginia or South Carolina, which would anger folks in Virginia or South Carolina because they couldn't sell stuff to North Carolina, right? And so states would start regulating their own trade between states, and the federal government had no ability to do anything with this. And the last thing is that if you wanted to change the Articles of Confederation, the way it was initially written, you had to have a unanimous vote of all 13 states to change anything in this Articles of Confederation document. This made it very difficult for that government to adapt or change, and made it very, very difficult to like adapting those changing situations. And so after a short period of time, they're going to realize like this system just doesn't work terribly well, and they're going to end up scrapping it and going and doing something different, right? But the big thing that really kind of leads, so there have been a lot of problems, but there's one major event that sort of leads to the founding fathers realizing that this Articles of Confederation just isn't going to work. And that is what's called Shays' Rebellion. Um, in response to the Revolutionary War, there had been a real economic downturn after the war ends because the states had all taken out tons of money to pay for the war. And in particular, states in the North, where most of the fighting was done and where most of the soldiers came from, had to take out massive loans in order to pay for the war. Like Massachusetts fought like about a third to half of the war on its own. Like a lot of the battles are up there in the North, and they're the ones that had to foot the bill because the federal government couldn't take out money on its own. It couldn't pay taxes. It couldn't take out money. And so what Massachusetts did is it had this massive debt, this huge economic problem, and the state of Massachusetts decided to raise taxes on its citizens in order to pay back some of these debts. Just like we've seen before, the new colonists, now the new Americans, are not a fan of paying these taxes. And you actually saw a lot of farmers out in the western part of the state of Massachusetts rebel and not want to pay the taxes. They went and like took over courthouses. And actually, like basically what happened is the state had put like a tax lien on their farm. The farmers couldn't refuse to pay it. And so the state would like foreclose on the farm in order to get their tax revenue. And what happened is the farmers went and like stormed the courthouses to try and shut them down to prevent these foreclosure proceedings from going on. And it caused all kinds of problems, right? Eventually, what ends up happening is a bankrupt farmer and former military captain named Daniel Shea ends up sort of leading this kind of agrarian revolt. Kind of similar in some ways to Bacon's rebellion almost 100 years before, where they went and stormed the Capitol in Jamestown and like burned it to the ground and tried to capture the governor of Virginia. Same kind of type of thing. Shea leads this rebellion, goes marching into Boston, and has picks up a bunch of weapons along the way, trying to shut down the government to prevent them from foreclosing on farmers' farms because of the taxes that the farmers didn't want to have to pay. Eventually, the local militias in Massachusetts, like the governor, calls out the militia and brings in the troops to, the citizen soldiers to stop this rebellion coming from the western part of the state. Um, but what it does is it shows that like this power to tax needs to be dealt with on a national level, that the federal government doesn't have the ability to wage, to have a military to do things like this. And it just really showed that the Articles of Confederation was really, really weak. It wasn't going to solve lots of problems. And so in the end, you're going to see in response to this, the government is going to try and get together and try and fix this. However, before we get there, one quote that's very famous is the one here on the left in particular. A quote that you'll hear a lot of times mentioned. It's taken a little out of context sometimes, but in response to Shays' Rebellion, this idea, Thomas Jefferson had this idea that, this should be a nation of like agrarian farmers, that, small villages and no big cities and stuff like that. And his idea that the government should be very, very small and most of the power should be in hands of like local citizens. And in response to Shays' Rebellion, what he thinks is the government overstepping its bounds and trying to tax the people too much. He's kind of he's on the side of some of the Shays' Rebellion folks, and he has this famous line: "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." Basically, freedom grows from stopping oppressive people from sometimes you got to be violent in order to stop oppressive people from taking away people's liberty. And it is that violence of like tossing the bad people out of office, sometimes with force, is sort of the fertilizer, the manure that allows for freedom to grow. And so some people will say that like Thomas Jefferson was in favor of like continual rebellion. And point to this quote. You'll see this quote mentioned sometimes. I think it's a little extreme, but still, that's sort of Jefferson's idea. Um, and so what ends up happening is people come together and try and figure out sort of an alternate plan. And they um, they first get together at in I believe it's in Maryland, in Annapolis, Maryland, I think, where they're realizing the economy of the government is sputtering, like it's really falling apart because the states aren't trading with each other because they're throwing these tariffs on the states and stuff like that. So there's no trade between like New York and Boston and North Carolina and Georgia because they have all these massively high tariffs. The states have these huge amounts of debt that they can't pay back, and so their economies are sort of going down the tubes. Shays' Rebellion showed that if you tried to raise taxes, people got really mad, and it took the state governments a lot of effort to try and stop these folks. And so what ends up happening is James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, a couple of sort of the early leaders of the country, get together and call this convention in Annapolis, Maryland, which is now the capital of Maryland. And they want to try and like, yeah, let's see if we can fix the Articles of Confederation, make some changes and stuff. Um, the problem is not a lot of people show up. And so what they do is they decide, okay, we're going to try this again next year. Like this is in the fall. They decide, all right, next spring, let's get together. I don't know, maybe Philadelphia is more popular. Maybe the spring's a little bit better time. Maybe it's not harvest season or whatever it is. And so we're going to meet again in May of next year in 1887, in 1787, in Philadelphia to see if we can fix some of these problems. Attendance the first round wasn't there. Let's see if we can try this a second time. And that is where you're going to get what is eventually becomes the U.S. Constitution. That next year, you've got folks from 12 of the states show up. This time, Georgia does show, but Rhode Island decides not to for some reason. And they come together in Philadelphia in what is now called Independence Hall and try and figure out ways to improve the Articles of Confederation. This meeting is led by James Madison, who ends up eventually becoming the fourth president of the United States and is sometimes called the father of the Constitution because he's the one in charge of this meeting, this convention, where a new document, a new government comes out of. He's sort of the one sort of kind of steering the ship, if you will. And they come together and they realize they've got three big problems. That there are three major problems with the Articles of Confederation that they need to fix. Eventually, they realize they can't just fix the Articles of Confederation. They just scrap the whole thing and do a whole different version. So the Constitution, which is what the whole different version is kind of America 2.0. You know, we tried it for 10 years. We realized a bunch of things didn't work. Let's dump it and fix all those problems and make a new version. The three problems they've got are first is this problem of representation, right? Do they want to have representation based upon population so that it's the same number of representatives per person, no matter if you are in a big state or a small state? Or do they want to have representation just based upon the state so that each state has an equal say? That's one of the big sort of divisions they've got. Second is they want to try and they realize they need a bigger central government. This really small, weak central government the Articles of Confederation had just didn't work. But they don't want to go the other direction too far because they don't want to give too much power to the central government because that's how they got into this problem in the first place when they had like a king that was not responsive to the people. And so, how do you find that kind of Goldilocks zone of a big enough central government and a strong enough central government to do the things it needs to, but not so strong that it ends up sort of becoming tyrannical and like taking away people's rights? And the third thing that they try and deal with is the issue of slavery, and especially how to count enslaved persons in population. You know, it's this big issue. Like the South has a very upwards of 50%, sometimes even more in states like South Carolina at the time. Their population is enslaved. If they're going to talk about like, well, we should count by population, how do you count those enslaved persons, or do you even count them at all? And it is this issue, this third issue, they're trying to address. We're going to get through, I think, maybe the first one of these, and we'll stop and pick up the next one in the next class. So the first issue they've got is this issue of representation, right? The idea of how should states be represented in a new legislature. Now, in theory, all states are supposed to be equal, but the problem is they're not. Some states are much bigger than others. Like the population in 1790s here on the right, you can see Delaware is like 60,000 people, whereas Virginia is almost 700,000, like 10 times more people. That's not equal in terms of population. That's not equal in terms of strength. And so how do you sort of deal with this? And there's two plans that are put forth. There's two sort of proposals. There's one put forward by a small state, the New Jersey plan, which is essentially the same type of thing that the Articles of Confederation had. Each state should get one vote, and so every state is equal. Population doesn't matter. That's what the small states put forward because the small states had a big advantage there. Of course, they're going to put forward. Virginia, the biggest state, puts forth their own plan of, hey, we should have two chambers and have each of them be represented by population. Bigger states should have more votes because they have more people. And so both of these plans are submitted. Neither of them get enough support to win on their own. But what they do is they sort of give a little bit of this and a little bit of that and decide to come together and come up with what is called sometimes the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. Come up with a guy by the name of Robert Sherman, who was from Connecticut, hence Connecticut Compromise. And what this did is this took a little bit from each of the Virginia and North and New Jersey plans. First, it called for a bicameral Congress, just like the Virginia plan had, a Congress with two different chambers. If something wants to become a law, it has to pass through two different bodies, right? And so the term bicameral means two rooms or two chambers. And so a Congress, the fancy term for Congress, is coming together. So we're going to have two chambers. And he said the first one is going to be a House of Representatives. And this is going to be sort of based on like that Virginia plan. And what it's going to do is it's going to be by population. And every 10 years, we'll take a new head count and see how many people there are. And based upon the total number of people, a census every 10 years, that we will then we will decide how many people each representative represents. And each representative will represent approximately the same number of people, no matter if you live in a big state or a small state. And these representatives will be elected every 2 years. That is what we now have as the House of Representatives. The second half of the compromise, like that in itself would make the small states mad. Big states, totally cool. More people, more power, right? The small states are like, but hey, all the states are equal, right? We should have an equal say with, the big states. That's where the second chamber comes in. They called this the Senate. This was sometimes called the upper house of Congress, has a little more authority and power than the lower house does. And this one would have two representatives per state, and it doesn't matter the size of the state. Big states, small states, they all have the same number of people, two per state. And these folks would be elected every 6 years. So the idea is this might be a little bit more senior members of the legislature, folks a little more experienced. And so they are in office for a little bit longer time. The House of Representatives, on the other hand, would change very frequently and would be much more responsive to like the people's whims. And so you have these two different chambers that you have. And so this is where you get the current Congress makeup today. You've got the House and the Senate. The Senate, each state, no matter if you're a big state like California or the smallest state in the country like Wyoming, is going to have the same number of senators. Each state gets two senators. The House of Representatives, however, is based by population. Some states, like these ones here in yellow at the top, are small enough in population, they've only got one House member for each state. But some like California currently has, I want to say, 54 members of the House. So they have like 54 times the population of Wyoming or South Dakota or North Dakota. And that is entirely based upon population. So that is kind of what we've got today. So today we've got 435 members of the House. Each of them represents a little shy of about 800,000 people. Like I say, California's got 52 districts as of last time around. You've got some smaller states that each only have one. It does lead to a little bit of an issue of, some smaller states have a little less representation. But you see these like funky little maps that are redrawn usually every 10 years. Now we're in the middle of apparently drawing them every like couple of years, be it Texas or California. But yeah. So that they solved problem number one. We're going to pick up next class with problem number two, talking about sort of the governmental powers of how trying to find that Goldilocks zone of enough power to solve problems, but not too much power to lead to like authoritarianism and tyranny. And so the first problem they addressed is this issue of representation, and we'll stop there.